In the years that followed, French automobiles and their drivers dueled with the English and Italians.
Here's a man who inherited one of the greatest industrial empires in American history, nearly ran it into the ground inside a decade, then spent the rest of his life making sure nobody around him ever got more credit than he did. Ford versus Ferrari wants you to see Henry Ford II as a lovable buffoon in an expensive suit, the guy who got talked into a racing program by a Texan with a cowboy hat and a gift for flattery. That version of the man is a lot easier to watch. It's also almost completely wrong. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, where we go looking for what the studios decided you didn't need to know. The Crown Prince who never earned the crown? Henry Ford II was born in 1917, the eldest grandson of Henry Ford, the man who had essentially invented the American middle class by paying his workers enough to buy the cars they built. And young Henry II, they called him the Deuce, which sounds like a compliment, but was really just family shorthand, grew up in a world where his last name was the most powerful noun in American manufacturing. He attended Yale. He did not graduate from Yale. He enrolled in the Navy during World War II and received a special discharge in 1943, arranged by his family, so he could return to Dearborn and take over a company that was, by most accounts, quietly collapsing. His grandfather, by then in his late 70s and suffering the effects of 2 strokes, had driven out every competent executive he'd ever hired. Henry Ford I was a genius, and a monster in roughly equal measure. A man who had revolutionized industrial production and also distributed anti-Semitic literature, fought his own workers with hired enforcers, and spent his final years dismantling the management structure of his own company out of pure paranoid stubbornness. The Deuce inherited all of that. The empire, the ego, and the blueprint for how to treat the people who worked for you. Ford versus Ferrari shows you a Henry Ford II who is vaguely embarrassed about his company's image, easily flattered, and willing to write a blank check on the strength of a good pitch. Tracy Letts plays him as bumbling, but ultimately benign. A rich man who got what he wanted because rich men usually do. What the film doesn't show you is the management philosophy he brought to Dearborn from day one. Henry Ford II believed that fear was a management tool, not a bug in the system, a feature. The Whiz Kids and the art of using people. To be fair to the Deuce, and I'll be fair to him exactly once per chapter, so pay attention. When he took over Ford in 1945, the company was genuinely in crisis. It was losing $1 million a day. Its accounting systems were so primitive that executives were literally counting cash in buckets. The whole operation was held together with institutional inertia and the Ford family name. What saved it was a group of 10 former Army Air Force's statistical control officers who arrived at Ford together in 1946 and offered their analytical skills as a package deal. They became known as the Whiz Kids. And the most famous of them, the one who would go on to become Secretary of Defense and architect of the Vietnam War's most catastrophic miscalculations, was a young man named Robert McNamara. McNamara and his group genuinely rescued Ford. They built the financial controls, the management structures, the planning systems that turned a dying family business into a modern corporation. McNamara eventually rose to become president of Ford Motor Company in 1960. The first person outside the Ford family to hold that title. He lasted 5 weeks. John F. Kennedy called and offered him the Secretary of Defense position, and McNamara left for Washington before he'd even learned where the executive bathroom was. But here's what the history books gloss over. Ford II's relationship with the Whiz Kids, with McNamara, with every executive who proved genuinely capable, followed the same pattern every single time. He needed them. He used them. He resented them for being needed. And the moment any of them became prominent enough that their names started appearing in the same sentences as his company's success, the clock started ticking. McNamara left before Ford II had to fire him. Most of the others weren't so lucky. The Deuce had a gift, and I use that word loosely, for waiting until a man had done his best work, until the results were undeniable, and then finding reasons to cut him loose. That way, Ford II got the credit, and the capable man got a severance package and a lesson in corporate loyalty. Carroll Shelby figured this out. Ken Miles never got the chance to. The Ferrari deal, status masquerading as sport, Ford versus Ferrari, frames the attempted Ferrari acquisition as wounded corporate pride. Henry Ford II sees the Sports Illustrated spread, feels humiliated that Ford makes cars for grandmothers while Ferrari wins at Le Mans, and decides to buy his way into racing credibility. That's partially true, but it misses the deeper pathology at work. Henry Ford II was obsessed with European legitimacy in a way that went well beyond business strategy. He married an Italian socialite. He spent enormous amounts of time in Europe. He cultivated relationships with the kind of old money aristocracy that wouldn't have let his grandfather park his Model T out front. For a man who had inherited everything and earned very little of it personally, European approval was a validation that American commercial success couldn't quite provide. Enzo Ferrari understood this immediately. And Enzo Ferrari, who was himself a ferocious egotist with a genius for psychological warfare, played the deuce like a concert piano. The negotiations in 1963 went exactly as the film suggests, except the emotional stakes were even higher than shown. Ford sent a team, led not by Lee Iacocca, despite what the film implies, but by a metallurgical engineer named Don Frey. And Enzo strung them along for weeks before blowing up the deal at the last moment over the racing team clause. But Enzo's final tirade, as reported by his own lawyer, wasn't just a negotiating tactic. It was a diagnosis. He called Ford's executives worthless sons who made big, ugly cars for a pig-headed boss. And the pig-headed boss, back in Dearborn, received this news and responded not with strategy, but with wounded personal fury. "All right," Shelby told the film version of Ford, "we'll beat his ass." The real Henry Ford II said something similar. But the expenditure that followed, somewhere between $25 million and $100 million, depending on whose accounting you believe, wasn't really about racing. It was about a man who had been called pig-headed by someone he desperately wanted to impress, spending whatever it took to make that person wrong. Ken Miles won Le Mans in that context, not as a sporting achievement, as a rich man's revenge. Lee Iacocca and the most famous firing in automotive history. If you want to understand Henry Ford II, forget Le Mans. The story that defines him happened in 1978, and it involves the man that Ford versus Ferrari plays as a secondary character with a slick haircut. Lee Iacocca had joined Ford in 1946, the same year the Whiz Kids arrived. He was a salesman from Pennsylvania with an engineering degree, a gift for marketing, and an almost biological need to be in the room where decisions got made. By the early 1960s, Iacocca had become the driving force behind the Ford Mustang. The car that saved Ford's image sold over 1 million units in its first 2 years and became the most successful automotive launch in American history up to that point. The Mustang made Lee Iacocca famous, and Henry Ford II never forgave him for it. The Deuce had a simple philosophy about fame. There was room for exactly one famous person at Ford Motor Company, and that person had been decided by birth. Iacocca's name appearing on magazine covers, Iacocca being credited with the Mustang, Iacocca becoming the public face of Ford's success. All of it was, to Henry Ford II, a form of theft. What followed was one of the most sustained corporate humiliation campaigns in American business history. Ford II began having Iacocca's expenses audited, then his phone calls monitored, then his travel reviewed for impropriety. He demoted Iacocca repeatedly, moving him from one powerless position to another, in what everyone in Dearborn understood was a waiting room with better furniture. Iacocca endured it because he believed, right up until the moment he was wrong, that performance would eventually matter more than politics. On July 13, 1978, Ford II called Iacocca into his office and fired him. Iacocca asked why. Ford II's answer has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of American business. Sometimes you just don't like somebody. That's it. That's the whole explanation. The man who had built the Mustang, who had revived Ford's commercial fortunes, who had given Henry Ford II his most culturally significant product since the Model T, got fired because the boss didn't like him. Iacocca went on to rescue Chrysler from bankruptcy, create the Dodge Viper alongside Carroll Shelby, and become one of the most celebrated executives of the 1980s. Henry Ford II watched all of it from Dearborn, and reportedly never once acknowledged that he'd made a mistake. The man who ruled by humiliation. The Iacocca firing wasn't an exception, it was the method. And once you understand that, the entire Le Mans story looks different. People who worked at Ford during the Deuce's tenure describe a culture that ran on intimidation the way the GT40 ran on gasoline. Executive meetings where Ford II would single out individuals for public dressings down in front of their peers. Not in private, not with any pretense of dignity. In front of the room, because the room was the point. Firings conducted with an audience, because an audience made the lesson land harder. Senior executives who spent their weekends dreading Monday mornings, rehearsing answers to questions they hoped nobody would ask. This wasn't a side effect of strong leadership. It was the entire operating system. Here's the thing that Ford versus Ferrari never quite explains. Carroll Shelby was not just a great car builder. He was a world-class reader of dangerous men. The cowboy hat, the folksy Texas charm, the aw-shucks self-deprecation, none of that was accidental. Shelby was performing a carefully calibrated version of himself, specifically engineered not to threaten a man who fired people for becoming too prominent. Every conversation Shelby had with Ford II was structured the same way. "You're the visionary, sir. I'm just the guy holding the wrench." Shelby made Ford II feel like the undisputed hero of every story they were in together. And in return, Ford II left Shelby alone long enough to win the most famous endurance race in the world. That's not charm. That's survival instinct dressed up in a Stetson. Ken Miles had none of that, not a single molecule of it. Miles was a mechanic in the deepest sense of the word, a man who believed that precision mattered, that honesty about a car's problems was the only responsible position, and that the quality of your work was its own argument. He said what he thought. He told Ford engineers their car was dangerous when it was dangerous. He pushed back when pushing back was the correct technical response. In any rational organization, that makes you invaluable. In the organization Henry Ford II had built in Dearborn that made you a problem waiting to be solved. So when the photo finish order came down at Le Mans in 1966, yes, Leo Beebe's fingerprints were on it. But Leo Beebe didn't build the culture that produced that decision. He inherited it, absorbed it, and faithfully reproduced it at the worst possible moment for Ken Miles. In a company where the single most important unwritten rule was make the boss look good, one driver winning the Triple Crown of endurance racing in a single year was always going to create a conflict. Ford wins. Le Mans is a clean headline. Ken Miles makes history as a story that has someone else's name in it. And Henry Ford II had been very clear for a very long time about how he felt about other people's names. 3 wives, 1 very public scandal, and the Italian years. Ford versus Ferrari doesn't have time for this, and honestly, fair enough. It's a racing film. But the personal life of Henry Ford II is its own separate education in how this man operated, and it fills in a piece of the puzzle that the boardroom scenes can't quite reach. He was married 3 times. The first marriage, to Anne McDonnell, lasted 25 years and produced 3 children. It ended in 1965 when Ford II left her for an Italian socialite named Christina Vittore Austin. By the standards of 1965 American Catholic society, this was not a quiet scandal. This was a grenade rolled into a country club. The Ford family were prominent Catholics. Anne was well liked by essentially everyone who met her. The Deuce simply decided he wanted something different and took it. The way he took most things, without particular apology and without much visible awareness that other people might experience the transaction differently than he did. He and Christina spent enormous amounts of time in Europe, particularly Italy. And this is where it gets interesting, because it connects directly back to the Ferrari story. Ford II was genuinely obsessed with European legitimacy in a way that went beyond taste or preference. He kept an Italian apartment. He collected Italian art. He cultivated relationships with old money European aristocracy that would have had no interest whatsoever in his grandfather. For a man who had inherited everything and personally earned relatively little of it, European approval provided a kind of validation that selling millions of cars in Ohio simply couldn't deliver. So, when Enzo Ferrari called his executives worthless sons who built ugly cars for a pig-headed boss, he wasn't just insulting a business proposal. He was poking the single sorest spot on the most sensitive man in Dearborn. That's worth remembering every time the film frames the racing program as corporate strategy. The second marriage ended in divorce. the third to Kathleen DeRoss, lasted until his death in 1987. He wasn't a monster in his personal life. He was something more ordinary, and in some ways more depressing. A powerful man who treated the people around him as extensions of his own needs and was genuinely surprised when they had feelings about it. The boardroom coup. By the late 1970s, the Ford Motor Company board had simply had enough. The Iacocca firing had been the breaking point for many of them, not because they particularly loved Iacocca, but because it demonstrated something they could no longer ignore. Henry Ford II was making decisions based on personal psychology rather than business logic. He was firing his best people. He was running an organization of nearly 500,000 employees, according to the same principles his grandfather had used to drive out every capable executive in Dearborn 4 decades earlier. The pattern was undeniable, and it was going to destroy the company. In 1978, the same year he fired Iacocca, Ford II was effectively forced out as chief executive. Philip Caldwell replaced him. Ford II retained the chairmanship for a few more years, a title without real power, a grandfather clock in an office, impressive to look at, and no longer setting the time for anything. The man who had spent 30 years making sure nobody at Ford got more powerful than him was pushed aside by the institution he'd spent those same 30 years building. There is a particular justice in that, though I suspect Henry Ford II did not appreciate it. He died on September 29, 1987, in Vail, Colorado. He was 70 years old. What he actually built, and what it cost. Here is where I have to be honest with you, because this channel doesn't do simple villains any more than it does simple heroes. Henry Ford II took over a company in 1945 that was losing $1 million a day and turned it into one of the dominant industrial organizations of the 20th century. He modernized Ford's management structure, expanded it globally, shepherded the Mustang and the GT40 into existence, and kept the Ford family name attached to something genuinely significant for 3 decades. That is not nothing. In fact, for most people, it would be everything. But the cost of what he built was paid by the people around him, by Robert McNamara's colleagues who stayed and got ground down, by Lee Iacocca, who endured years of deliberate humiliation before building something greater at Chrysler, by Carroll Shelby, who understood the system well enough to survive it but never quite trusted it, and by Ken Miles, who never got the victory he earned, who died 2 months later testing a car with a design flaw the company already knew about, and whose name wasn't a household word until a Hollywood film came along 53 years after his death. Ford vs. Ferrari gave us Leo Beebe as the villain. Leo Beebe was a middle manager executing a culture that came from somewhere above him. The real story of what happened to Ken Miles at Le Mans in 1966, and what happened to him in a California desert in August of that year, runs all the way up the org chart to a man in an expensive suit who believed that sometimes you just don't like somebody, and that was reason enough to take whatever you wanted. Henry Ford II built something extraordinary. He just made sure he never had to share the credit with anyone who actually helped him do it. And that is the part that Ford vs. Ferrari, for all its glorious racing sequences and all of Christian Bale's heartbreaking work, never quite found the time to tell you. If you want the real stories behind the legends Hollywood cleaned up for your consumption, you are in the right place. New episodes every week. I'm Johnny, this is American Muscle, and I'll see you in the next one.